I love it how intuitively guided we are when we allow Spirit to happen through us, because everything that was done already, I feel like you guys already did my talk, so thank you very much. It was nice to be here. I'll just pocket this and I'll do it. So, actually, a few weeks ago, I was at a reading by Rasha, who's an American mystic living at the foot of one of the mountains in India. And I was initially in the front row, and I don't like sitting in the front row at those kind of things. I feel really exposed. And so I saw an opportunity, and I scooted around to the back row. Into the second row. And after I did that, this guy in the third row, about where you're sitting, sir, leaned forward to me and touched me on the shoulder, and he goes, "That's a good idea, because in my experience, I found that ministers spit." and I laughed, and I said, "That's good to know, I'm a minister." And you should have seen his face turn this beet red. That we had a good laugh about it. So you guys are kind of far away, but if it happens, please let me know later. Anyway, Rasha has one of her initial books was called The Calling. And in The Calling, she says, "The time for carting away that which no longer serves you is now. The time for beginning to build the fundamental structure that will support you in the role you have chosen to play in the times to come is now. The time for recognizing your unlimited divine essence is now. And the time for polishing that essence to serve God without reservation is now. And to know, without question, that for you there is truly no other way." I start with this quote to talk about Emma Curtis Hopkins, because this is exactly what Emma Curtis Hopkins has encouraged us to do through her work back in the early 1900s, 1920s. And she encourages us to deal with our internal issues and then to let them go and to step out and start life anew, in a sense, and to deal with the important issues at hand. And she says that we need to deal with our lives, how we deal with our lives is a matter of our faith. And it's not about the individual, it's about the oneness that we bring together as we step out in faith. And it's about how we present to the world at large. How do we deal? How do we dress? How do we treat ourselves? And then how do we go out and talk to others? This is what Emma Curtis Hopkins is talking about. And individually, we are intrinsic to how oneness in the world evolves. This is the key. So I started last month when I was here by saying, come to my workshop in Silva. I'm doing an all-day Hopkins retreat. And it was amazing. And so now today I'm here to talk to you about kind of how all of that came together for me and to give you Emma Curtis Hopkins in a nutshell. Even though individually we are intrinsic to how oneness evolves, the truth is that life always evolves. Life always falls forward. We always move forward. Even when we say for people in domestic violence relationships, oh, she went back to him. She didn't really. She seemed to appear to go back to a situation, but it's a different situation. Even when, if we have alcohol or drug abuse and we say, oh, they went back out, which I did numerous times in my teens, you don't go back out. You go back to a different place. But you don't really go back. You kind of land where you are and you're moving forward with diminished skills. And so that's another important thing, because nothing stays the same. Nothing ever stays the same. We may end up in similar situations, but we don't go back. The past is gone forever. The past is gone forever, and it is what we do right now in this moment that creates our future as we take that next step, that next breath. we release and we let go. And this is what Emma Curtis Hopkins stresses throughout her work. And she has several books. I didn't bring them with me, but there's many. And she was one of the primary teachers of Unity, as you all know. But what I did find out when I was prepping for that retreat was that Emma Curtis Hopkins writes in sequences of 12. And I didn't know about the number 12. Is anybody here a numerologist or knows about this 12 thing? I didn't. And I suspected it was because of the 12 disciples, right? But for all I knew, it could have just as easily been the 12 months of the year. It could have been 12 days of Christmas. It could have been 12 anything. And then I started realizing 12 is everywhere. 12 is, well, the number 12 is the result of 4 times 3. The 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire. The 4 corners of the earth. And all that dispersed of Judah. This is from Isaiah 11:12. And gather the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth, which even as recently as the Olympics, the last Olympics, on the news they were saying, and athletes gathered from the 4 corners of the world, like that. And then we have the 4 cardinal points, which are north, east, south, and west. And when these are multiplied, 4 times 3, 3 being the sacred number, the result is 12, which is the perfect number. Other information about 12 is the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 is the symbol of the cosmic order. 12 is the number of space and time. 12 is measured in 2 groups of 12 hours. And the number 12 as a sacred symbol is found in most cultures and religions. I did not know all of that. And it goes on and on and on. And surprisingly, we had 13 people register for my workshop. And 12 came. And when I sent, no one realized that until I sent out emails at the end, and I started counting the names. It was like, oh my God, there were 12 people. No wonder it was so divinely ordered, right? And so in that sense, it's not surprising that Hopkins uses the number 12 to represent oneness. And so who was Emma Curtis Hopkins? Let's just talk about her for a moment. She was born in 1849 and she died in 1925. She was an American spiritual author and leader. She was involved in organizing the New Thought movement and was primarily a theologian, a teacher, a writer. She was a feminist. She was an activist. She was a mystic. And many people feel that she was a prophet. Many argue that she was the founder of the New Thought movement. And she has been named the teacher of teachers. She started her own school. She wrote High Mysticism, Scientific Christian Mental Practice. She was a student of Mary Baker Eddy. She came from Christian Science. She started her own school. And she was named the teacher of teachers. Many of her students went on to become prominent. There was Annie Ritz-Militz, who is a spiritualist and a physician. Melinda E. Kramer, who co-founded Divine Science. One of her last students, we think, was Ernest Holmes, who was the founder of religious science and the author of Science of Mind. And then, of course, there was Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, who were the founders of Unity. And Emily Cady, who is the author of Lessons in Truth, the textbook of Unity. And so this is Emma Curtis Hopkins. And everything that we've learned is Emma Curtis Hopkins. From me, in my primary is Science of Mind, and I have a lot of smatterings of Unity in there. And Charles Fillmore once stated that she is undoubtedly the most successful teacher in the world. Her very presence heals, and those who listen are filled with new life. Never before on this planet have such words of burning truth been so eloquently spoken through a woman. So thank you, Charles. So in Scientific Christian Mental Practice, Emma states, when the Lord is your confidence, you will never find yourself at all deceived by the ways in speech of men and women, though they be very brilliant. I like that a lot. When my faith is in the divine, I will not be swayed by the ways and speech of other people, though they be very brilliant. And that gives me a sense of comfort, because sometimes I feel like I'm easily swayed. However, Hopkins discusses how we identify and interpret what is said or done to us. And she says, first we have the literal interpretation. It's known as the letter of the law. And this is, we know this is when we take those sacred scriptures of the law and we apply them verbatim without interpretation. We see the face value of the words themselves. But we know that culture rewrites over time. We can never take the face value of anything because it changes. It changes immediately through our perceptions, and then my perception is different than your perception. So though we may say the same scripture, it will never be applied in the same way, although that's the intent. And so only in some cases is there an eye for an eye, right, or a tooth for a tooth. But what we do know is that there's always an exception to the rule. There's always an exception to the rule for literal interpretation. So the first is the literal interpretation. The second is our mental interpretation. And this is where we analyze and metaphorically arrive at conclusions. This is where we read and we study and we try to understand the law, and then we make these declarations and we say, this is the way it is because now I understand it. And this is exactly what we all do. I read all of her books. I read about 7 books of Hopkins to get ready for the retreat, and then I read what other people wrote about her, and I thought, I understand it like that, and I can make these declarations about Emma Curtis Hopkins. But here's what Emma says, is that while we make declarations and affirmations, we also make denials in order to achieve and assert the power of law. So once we think we know something, then we use our base knowledge, almost in a literal interpretation, to declare that this is the truth. And this is what we often do in our New Thought movement, is that we grasp what we believe is truth, and then we declare it and say, this is the truth. This is the truth. And then thirdly, she says that we have a spiritual understanding. And that spiritual understanding is simply knowing that all we have to do is be. We don't need to declare it. We don't need to interpret it. We don't need to have a literal interpretation or a mental interpretation. All we need to do is feel it, to be it, to move with spirit, and know that's the truth. Now, we all know that that's a process. We start with literal interpretation, we go to mental interpretation, and then we embody the truth. And that's where it comes to being the I am. And Emma would say that we need to go through all 3 stages. One is not any better or any worse than the other in order to get to where we are today. True matter of what Hopkins taught is that since everyone is an aspect of one source, what each of us have chosen to think and imagine is within our privilege, our power, our ability, and it is the truth. It all becomes one, individually. And so on this, Ernest Holmes states that every individual acts according to their level of awareness. And I believe they're saying essentially the same thing, that every individual is essentially just on their own path, right? To put it simply, we're at the level of our awareness. The awareness of some people is at a different level, and we judge that, right? And so I believe that the issue is one of duality. And I believe I may have talked about duality here before, that we believe in good and bad, that there is essentially an inherent, even though we say we don't believe in evil, we have this thing about good and evil, good and bad, black and white, right and wrong. We feel like we know what the right thing is. And if we know what the right thing is, then inherently we've already decided that there's a bad thing over here. And so Mark Nepo, in 7,000 Ways to Listen, and I believe I may have said this quote before too, understanding where and how we are inwardly divided, where and how we are inwardly divided, leads to the center of our tensions. Because that duality, facing our inner divisions, is the first step to knowing how to rejoin ourselves. So if we have a duality, if we're just looking at something as coffee is bad, but tea is good, then we need to revisit that statement and revisit that neither is good or bad. They just are. Everything simply is, because everything is part of the oneness. And so he says, Mark Nepo, you cannot set bone until you know where it is broken. And you cannot set upon the journey of individuation until you know when and how you are divided. So Hopkins encourages us to look at the duality. And then she says, move on to the truth. She says, don't stay in the story. The first 6 lessons of Emma Curtis Hopkins are all about finding your dualities, are all about facing your inner tensions. And then the last 6 are taking those first 6 and moving out into the world with it. And as Carolyn, she says, don't stay in the story. Or as Carolyn Nice says, it's time to get up off the couch, right? It's time to move. That this safe place is really no longer the place for you to be. We have to continually fall forward. In the affirmation, Hopkins makes it very simple and very straightforward. She says, I am. I am that which I claim because there is only one. Jesus claimed that I am. I am the power. I am the glory. Right? And we can claim that as well, because we were all one within the shadow of the divine, so to speak, that we are the power and the glory if we are the living word of Christ, right? If we are the living word of the divine, then we are the power and the glory. And to take that, we don't create anew, we already manifest, right? We manifest. We don't create wealth, we don't create a business, we don't create dinner, really. We have creative self-expression in all of those things. But what we do is manifest whatever it is, because it's already there. Health, wealth, relationships, self-expression, it's already here. And we only need to bring it into our awareness. And then once we're aware, we need to be aware. Emma Curtis Hopkins encourages us to be greater, to be fuller, to do more. Once you've arrived, open the door and keep on going. And she says, your good is your God. That's her line. Your good is your God. So whatever good is in your life is your God. I have a lot of good in my life. I'm really, really blessed. And I feel like God then is all around me. When I was sitting here, during Ruth's songs, I was looking through the window at the light hitting that creek down there, and felt so blessed. It was, what a gorgeous place that we're in today. It's just beautiful. And so I ask you, if your good is your God, then who are you? As a group, as a church, as a congregation, who are we as a nation? And then in your own self-reflection, ask yourself, who am I? Where do I stand? Am I bound by my past, a past as recent as something I may have said yesterday? Or have I stood in the fire? And have I faced those hidden spaces? Have I really looked at those tensions within myself, some of which we may be feeling right now as I'm talking, depending on how we react to different words that I've used. So where do I stand? Am I a spiritual warrior? Am I willing to stand in the unknown? Am I willing to embrace my fears? Am I willing to move in the direction of heart, peace, and love? Do I embrace difference? And have I invited that apparent other into my home? Have I broke bread with them? Have I said hello to them on the street? And we all know who we're talking about, the very people who may not be in this room today, who we may consider other and different from ourselves. I believe that confusion happens when we buy into our fear. And Nepo, on another story, tells the story of an old woodsman who told him once that the reason people get lost is because they get afraid and confused and they turn around too soon. They don't go far enough. And Emma Curtis Hopkins encourages us to go further, right? To step out into faith and to relinquish our fear and let it go into the past. Holmes, in Science and Mind, says this: one alone in consciousness with the infinite constitutes a complete majority. One alone in consciousness with the infinite constitutes a complete majority. This is your self-efficacy. This is your way home to self. This is your way to Emma Curtis Hopkins, the I am. One alone in consciousness with the divine constitutes a complete majority. This is who we are. What we tell ourselves and how we talk to ourselves is key to how we move in the world and to how we know the spiritual truth. It is time to get up off our couches. It's time to live in the light. It's time for each of us to claim our presence in the spiritual divine on this earth and to move forward. To know that we step forward in oneness and that we know the truth. As spiritual warriors, we don't get to claim one safe little space of sofa. We can for a little bit. Like I have often watched Netflix for hours at a time, but then something hits me and I have to get up off the sofa. We can't stay there always. We have to move. And so take your break, but then get back out into it because we need you. We need you in the world. As spiritual warriors, if I stand on sacred ground, then you stand on sacred ground. And the same is with beholding the vision of the mountains and breathing the air or drinking the water. It's all one. We're all made of one. We may have a slightly different vista, but it's all one. You might want a Subaru and I might want a Cadillac, right? Or I have a Subaru and maybe you have a Cadillac. But really what we both wanted was a car. And it's only the details that vary. The thing itself stays the same, right? We all have preferences, but it's the thing itself that stays the same. We all want the same thing. With the great I am, we don't ask to be prosperous tomorrow. We state the present and we're propelled forward into right action. Right? All the intelligence of the world flows through me now. That's what happens when we're one with the divine. So say to yourself today and every day that I am. And state that I am in a quality of God. And the 7 that I learned during my ministerial teaching that hold the most truth for me is that I am peace, I am power, I am light, I am love, I am life, I am joy, I am truth, and I am harmony. That's actually 8, but really doesn't matter. It's all one, right? And so I encourage you to say the same things to yourself. Pick one every morning when you get up. It's good to read the other things because that's that intellectual knowing, but move into spirit and know the truth of who you are. You are the light. You, as Emma Curtis Hopkins says, are the fearless guardian of the divine light. Isn't that lovely? You are the fearless guardian of the divine light. And I believe that we are the vanguard of change in this world. So know who you are. Be brave, be fearless, be one with others, and let your light shine. And thank you very much.